On August 2nd, 1997, the Atlanta Fulton County Stadium was demolished. Although the concrete crumbled to the ground in less than 30 seconds, certain events within its 32-year history passed on into perpetual legend at that moment. Hank Aaron's record-breaking 715th home run in 1974 occurred here, as well as the Braves' 1995 World Series win. But one of the most fabled events happened just 4 months after the stadium's completion, when the most famous band in the world came to pay a visit to Atlanta. The date was August 18th, and the Beatles were on their 1965 nine-city North American tour. The first date had been their legendary record-breaking Shea Stadium concert in New York. Next were 2 shows at Toronto's Maple Leaf Gardens, after which the Beatles headed south. The tickets for the Atlanta show had gone on sale a couple of months prior. The field level seats, which sold out, were $5.50, and the upper level seats, $4.50. In the days leading up, the Journal and Constitution had been featuring articles on the upcoming show, as well as advice on stadium parking and comments from Atlanta teens. The August 17th edition of the Journal even had an article showing how to give a Beatle haircut. The 18th was a muggy 90-degree day, and at 2 p.m., the Beatles' chartered plane arrived from Toronto at Hartsfield Airport and taxied to a remote part of the field, out of view from the fans that had turned up at the terminal. Safety concerns now rarely ever permitted the Beatles to disembark while greeting the crowds as they once had. By 1965, the intensity of Beatlemania had increased to a frightening and dangerous point. They discreetly boarded a group of 3 limousines and headed for Atlanta Stadium. At the stadium, a locker room was set up as a dressing area and makeshift headquarters for the Beatles and their entourage. Paul McCartney requested a giant fan for use in the unair-conditioned stadium vestibule, while Ringo Starr, wishing to wash his hair, requested a hairdryer. The concert promoter hastily supplied a stand-up model commandeered from his wife. Some tables, chairs, and half-dozen cots were placed in the changing area. The British, the Atlantans learned, referred to these as camp beds. Ringo, upon hearing them referred to as cots, humorously climbed onto one, curled up, and began sucking his thumb loudly, much to the amusement of everyone in the room. The caterer hired to supply the Beatles' dinner inquired if it was true that they preferred hamburgers. The Beatles quickly shot down that rumor and asked if he could get them corn on a stick, otherwise known to us as corn on the cob. Outside the stadium, the fans had begun to gather, waiting for the gates to open, some walking around the perimeter of the stadium, kissing their tickets. 2 15-year-old girls from Florida arrived at 4:30 a.m. that morning. Fans were also arriving from nearby cities, not included on the tour schedule. Inside, the giant fan wasn't doing much good, and George Harrison had given up hope of getting his guitars tuned properly in the clammy dog day atmosphere. Many VIPs dropped by to visit the Beatles, who graciously posed for photos and signed autographs. McCartney, never far from his camera, took quite a few shots of the proceedings himself. Approximately 150 reporters, many from high school newspapers, had gathered for the Beatles' press conference, which began just after 5 p.m. The Beatles answered questions about the tour, their musical tastes, and about Paul's girlfriend, British actress Jane Asher. Mayor Ivan Allen then awarded the Beatles the key to Atlanta and proclaimed them honorary citizens. Later, the musicians dined on their catered meal consisting of top sirloin, leg of lamb, and pork loin, along with the requested corn on the cob, pole beans, fruit, and apple pie. The Beatles, so used to surviving on cocktail sausages and soda while on the road, considered this the best meal they'd ever had on tour. So much so, in fact, that they autographed their 4 china plates for the caterer, John signing his, "Thanks for a flatware." Out on the ball field, as the daylight began to fade, the stadium's giant floodlights were switched on. The digital clock high above the stands read 6:21 as the gates were opened and the fans began to trickle in. Mal Evans, the Beatles' roadie, climbed up onto the stage to do his equipment check. The stage, made out of scaffolding boards and white canvas material, was uncovered, causing a potential electrical hazard in the event of rain. Baker Audio, the Atlanta company hired to supply the sound system, had no way to estimate how loud the audience was going to be and hauled in every speaker they had. Placing large clusters of speakers at first and third bases, they were able to create about 5,000 watts of amplification. 3 lines of police barriers had been set up between the stands and the field. Some of them painted bright yellow read, "Police line, do not cross," while others simply read, "Bureau of Sanitation." Down in the dugout, unnoticed by the fans, John Lennon peered out to inspect the pre-show situation. He was soon joined by George and tour manager Neil Aspinall, who gave the two Beatles their instructions on exiting the tunnel and crossing the field to the stage at showtime. They were told that there would be a vehicle behind the stage with the engine running for their hasty exit after their final song. There would be no encores or delays. George and John then retreated to the locker room until showtime. Once back inside, Mal Evans handed the Beatles the 4 freshly pressed white shirts for the band to wear under their matching blue suits. Paul commented that the suits are more comfortable than the military-type jackets they'd worn at Shea Stadium. At 7:30, the audience witnessed the London Look fashion show sponsored by Regensteins and featuring music by local band the Atlanta Vibrations, who had recently won a Beatle Battle of the Bands contest. By showtime, the crowd swelled to approximately 30,000. The show's MCs were Tony Taylor and Paul Drew, both of WQXI AM Quixie and Dixie, who introduced each act preceding the Beatles. The first set was by King Curtis, who was followed by a go-go dance troupe called the Discotheque Dancers, then Cannibal and the Headhunters, Brenda Holloway, and finally Sounds Incorporated. When the stadium clock read 9:37, Paul Drew introduced the Beatles, who suddenly appeared from the third base dugout and sprinted to the stage. The crowd erupted into one continuous earth-shaking scream, and the stands lit up with camera flashes that sparkled like fireworks. A Beatles stadium concert didn't need a light show or special effects. Instead, there was the awe-inspiring spectacle of their fervent audience. The Beatles plugged in and launched into their hit Twist and Shout, followed immediately by She's a Woman. As Paul began to introduce their third number, he stopped, apparently amazed that he could hear his own voice, and commented, "It's loud, isn't it? Great." Over the last 2 years of Beatlemania, the band had grown accustomed to being drowned out by their audience and could rarely hear their own music. McCartney in particular seemed to be delighted with the sound at Atlanta Stadium, and Baker Audio was later approached by the Beatles management to consult on some subsequent U.S. shows. The show continued with I Feel Fine, Dizzy Miss Lizzie, Ticket to Ride, Everybody's Trying to Be My Baby, Can't Buy Me Love, and Babies in Black, which John humorously introduced as Babies in Blackpool. The next song, featuring Ringo's only lead vocal for the night, was I Want to Be Your Man, during which Paul broke a string on his trademark Hofner bass guitar. After Paul swapped his bass for another, they played A Hard Day's Night. The crowd showed no signs of calming down. The 6 first aid stations filled up with girls who had fainted, overcome by being in the same stadium as their idols. Girls at field level threw themselves directly over the railing into the arms of the 150 policemen hired to keep the fans from charging the stage. The Beatles gave a very energetic performance and seemed, possibly because they could hear themselves, musically tighter than at the Shea Stadium show. After singing Help, their newest hit at the moment, John switched from his guitar over to a Vox organ. Paul thanked the audience for coming and then belted out the opening to their final song, I'm Down. A few seconds after finishing, the Beatles were down the stairs and into their limo. Accompanied by a police escort, they made tracks for the airport, with about 30 fans chasing behind. The Beatles' plane took off just before midnight, bound for Houston, where they had a 3:30 show the following afternoon. In less than just 10 hours after they'd arrived, the Beatles departed Atlanta. The August 19th issues of the Atlanta Journal and the Constitution featured photos, articles, and comments about the show, and reported the attendance to be 34,000. It would turn out to be the only concert the Beatles played in Atlanta, as the group ceased touring the following year. Mayor Ivan Allen was quoted, "They're excellent boys. The only improvement I'd make, I'd cut their hair a little bit." So let me ask you, do you remember? Were you there? And even if you weren't there, what are your memories of that wild, wonderful day when the Beatles came to our town? Let me know. I'm Dr. William Lester. Thank you so much for joining me on a journey to Atlanta back then.